So let's start by clarifying what white supremacy is before we get into it in greater detail. White supremacy is the belief, theory, or doctrine that white people are inherently superior to people from all other racial and ethnic groups, especially black people, and are therefore rightfully the dominant group in any society. Okay, so simply put, white supremacy is the belief that white people are better and that they should be in charge. Um, the phrase is also used to describe a political ideology that maintains and perpetuates the social, political, historical, or institutional domination by white people. So, for example, historical and contemporary socio-political structures such as the transatlantic slave trade. And these socio-political structures often made black people believe that white people were superior because that's the way the system's designed. White supremacy has roots in the now discredited doctrine of scientific racism. Scientific racism was the belief that through scientific evidence, racial discrimination and racial inferiority or superiority could be proven and justified. As I said, it's now been discredited and it's simply not true. Scientific racism often relies on what is known as pseudoscientific arguments. These are statements that are claimed to be both scientific and factual, but in reality are incompatible with scientific method, therefore cannot be classified as scientific. Here is a quote by Frank L. Baum, the author of the popular Wizard of Oz children's books. In 1890, during an interview, he stated, "The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians." Let's look at white supremacy in America. If you recall, a couple slides ago, I mentioned white supremacy had been around pretty much as long as white people had. So white supremacy in America was not new, far from it. However, I'll start with the American Civil War. So, as we learned previously, when we looked at slavery, the cause for the Civil War was that the Confederate States did not want to abolish slavery. The desire to uphold white supremacy was actually cited as a cause for state secession and the formation of the Confederate States of America. In 1790, some 60 years before the American Civil War, the Naturalization Act was passed, limiting US citizenship to whites only. So if you happen to be a free black person or even a Native American, you were not recognized as a citizen in America. And if you think back to colonialism, who did the colonizers take the land from? And if you're thinking, well, 1790 was a long time ago, it was over 200 years ago, the American Civil War was well over 150 years ago, there's not even anyone alive on the planet who was alive then. Well, it might surprise you to know that in some parts of the United States, many people who were considered non-white were disenfranchised, barred from government jobs, and prevented from holding most government jobs well into the second half of the 20th century. And we all know someone who was alive during the second half of the 20th century. Professor Leland Sato is a professor of sociology, American studies, and ethnicity at the University of Southern California, and he has stated that throughout the history of the United States, race has been used by whites for legitimizing and creating difference in social, economic, and political exclusion. In short, white supremacy in the United States is systemic. It's how the system is designed. Okay, so when people think of white supremacy, there are generally two main groups that their thoughts turn to: Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, or the Ku Klux Klan. They're not the only two major hate groups who have existed throughout history, but I suppose the fact that they are the two often thought of or referred to when it comes to white supremacy means they had very memorable marketing strategies. So the Ku Klux Klan are most commonly referred to as the KKK or the Klan, and I'll use these names interchangeably, but I'm referring to the same organization. They were and still are an American white supremacist hate group whose primary target is African Americans. The Klan are considered a right-wing extremist organization and over the years have called for the purification of American society, frequently making references to America's Anglo-Saxon blood, the blood of its colonial settlers. And although members of the KKK swear to uphold Christian morality, the group is widely denounced by Christian denominations. The first Klan was founded by 6 former officers from the Confederate Army as a fraternal social club, partly inspired by the Sons of Malta. This was on Christmas Eve 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. When the Klan started, there wasn't really any organisational structure above the local level, but similar groups started to pop up all across the South, and they adopted the same name and the same methods. Klan groups spread throughout the South as an insurgent movement promoting resistance and white supremacy during the Reconstruction era. In the late 1860s, the Klan used terrorism in the form of both physical assault and murder, targeting white Northern leaders, Southern sympathisers, and politically active blacks and their allies in the South. The KKK embodied how many white people felt in the South. Therefore, the organisation flourished in the southern United States in the late 1860s after the Civil War ended. The Klan sought to overthrow the Republican state government in the South, especially by using violence against leaders within the African American community. Members of the Klan made their own, often colourful costumes. These costumes included robes, masks, and conical hats designed not only to be visually terrifying, but serving as a practical purpose of hiding members' identities. Being able to operate in secret as a secret vigilante group, the Klan targeted freedmen and their allies seeking to restore white supremacy by use of threats, use of violence, and this violence often included murder. Lynchings of black people were commonplace in the South around this time. In 1915, the Klan had a resurgence in Georgia, and that only grew throughout the South during the 1920s. This was in large part a result of the silent film The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. The film mythologized the founding of the first Klan and is considered one of the most controversial films ever made. The film was set during the American Civil War and portrayed African Americans as unintelligent and sexually aggressive towards white women, and presented the Ku Klux Klan as a heroic force. The black characters in the film were portrayed by white actors in blackface. In February 1915, Birth of a Nation was the first film ever to be shown in the White House, when there was a special screening in the East Room that was attended by then President Woodrow Wilson. At the time, this screening caused public uproar. The release of Birth of a Nation and subsequent resurgence of the KKK is probably one of the earliest examples of the power of the media, the power that TV and film has in influencing people's beliefs, whether based on fact or not. The Klan are notorious for their hatred of the black community, with black people being their primary target. However, in addition to blacks, the Klan also opposed Jews, Catholics, and newly arriving Southern and Eastern European immigrants such as Italians, Russians, and Lithuanians, many of whom were Jewish or Catholic. From around 1921, the KKK started to operate as a business. It adopted a business model and started to use full-time recruiting staff to bring in new members, advertising itself as a fraternal organisation. Within its marketing strategy, it capitalized on social tensions between urban and rural America, and they made themselves visible in every state and prominent within main cities all across the United States. Membership of the Klan peaked in the mid-1920s, with around 15% of the eligible population of the United States being Klan affiliated. That's approximately somewhere between 4 and 5 million white men, and a lot of these men were members of the law enforcement community, judges, politicians, and even legislatures. The anonymity the costume provided meant these people in notable positions of power could continue to work their jobs as normal without anyone knowing their particular racial biases, even though a lot of the time their job involved making decisions that affected the lives of black people. Jim Crow laws refer to a group of state and local laws that enforced racial segregation in the southern United States up until 1965. The laws were enacted in the late 19th and early 20th century by white state legislatures with the intent to disenfranchise and remove political power from black people and remove any economic gains made by blacks during the Reconstruction period. Since the end of slavery, blacks had begun to integrate into society and start building their lives as free people, and Jim Crow laws were there to keep whites and blacks separate, with whites in a superior position. The implementation of Jim Crow laws institutionalized economic, educational, and social disadvantages for African Americans living in the South. For example, facilities for African Americans were consistently inferior and underfunded compared to the facilities for white Americans, and that's even if there were facilities. Oftentimes, there were no facilities provided for them at all. Jim Crow laws mandated the segregation of public schools, public places, and public transportation. This included the segregation of restrooms, restaurants, and drinking fountains for whites and blacks. So if you were black and you had a white friend, it was illegal for you to attend the same school. If you wanted to go to the cinema with a friend of a different ethnicity than your own, then at the very least you wouldn't be able to sit together, and in some cases you wouldn't even be able to go to the same cinema. If you wanted to go swimming with a friend of a different ethnicity, swimming pools were also segregated. Even water fountains were separated into whites only and blacks only drinking fountains. Interracial marriages were also illegal, and interracial relationships were frowned upon, often leading to societal repercussions. You might recall from when we looked at slavery that enslaved Africans were prohibited from learning to read and write. Therefore, when it came to voting, most black people were unable to vote due to the fact that they couldn't pass the mandatory voter literacy test. Let's just unpack that. Laws that were made by white men and affected the lives of everyone, including black people. Those laws predominantly worked in the interests of white people. The only way to get the laws changed is to vote for someone whose policies best align with your beliefs. But you can't vote for that change because for generations your people have been withheld access to education, so you can't read or write. And to be allowed to vote, you must be able to read and write. So you can see how the system was designed to benefit white people and disenfranchise African Americans. In 1896, there was a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. It was a landmark ruling by the US Supreme Court that upheld the legality of racial segregation under the belief that blacks and whites are separate but equal. This case stemmed from an incident in 1892 when an African American train passenger named Homer Plessy refused to sit in a carriage for blacks. The court rejected Homer Plessy's argument that his constitutional rights were violated and ruled that a law that implies merely a legal distinction between whites and blacks was not unconstitutional. As a result of the Plessy case, restrictive Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race became very common. The legal principle of separate but equal seemed to somehow justify the segregation of public facilities and transportation, including the coaches of interstate trains and buses. Now remember, Jim Crow laws were only adopted by the South. Northern states never adopted Jim Crow laws. However, this isn't to say that the northern states were perfect and that black people didn't experience discrimination. Black people in the North experienced discrimination at their jobs, when they tried to buy a house, or even when they were just trying to get an education. In addition, some northern states passed laws to limit voting rights for black Americans. In the years following slavery, many African Americans started to rebuild their lives as free people. A group of free men and women established a freedom colony in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. During the Jim Crow era, African Americans weren't allowed to make purchases or use services in predominantly white areas. Some economists believe this forced many African Americans to spend their money where they would feel welcomed, effectively insulating cash flow within the black community and allowing Greenwood to flourish and prosper. The Greenwood district of Tulsa was one of the most commercially successful and affluent majority African American communities in the United States and became known as the Black Wall Street. As mentioned previously when we learned about slavery, Wall Street was and still is a financial district in New York City. In the early days of slavery, the area was home to the largest slave market in America, and a lot of the banks that established Wall Street were founded from the profits of slavery in the South. On Black Wall Street, there were African American attorneys, real estate agents, dentists, entrepreneurs, and doctors who offered their services within the community. The district was built on black-owned businesses and provided services to the black community that lived there, and the district thrived. At the time, it was the wealthiest black community in the United States. That was until the 31st of May, 1921, when mobs of white residents of Tulsa attacked black residents and businesses of the Greenwood district. The attack on Greenwood was carried out both on the ground and air by private aircraft. It destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the district, which, as I mentioned at the time, was the wealthiest black community in the United States. The entire district was burned to the ground, and white residents massacred as many as 300 black residents. More than 800 people were admitted to hospital, and as many as 6,000 black residents were detained at large encampments, many for several days. The riot was one of the most devastating massacres in the history of US race relations. So, what happened to trigger the events that led to the destruction of Greenwood? Well, a 19-year-old African American boy named Dick Rowland worked as a shoe shine boy. Dick was accused of assaulting a white 17-year-old lift operator named Sarah Page, who worked in a nearby building. Dick was arrested and taken into custody. An angry mob of local white men gathered outside the courthouse when Dick was being detained, and rumours began to spread amongst them that Dick Rowland had been lynched. The rumours spread and reached Greenwood, which understandably alarmed the local black population and led to some of the community turning up at the courthouse armed. The white people at the courthouse were already riled up, and when the black people arrived, violence broke out. Both sides were armed and shots were fired. 12 people were killed, 10 white and 2 black. News of the deaths spread throughout the city and violence exploded. White rioters rampaged through Greenwood that night and the following morning. They killed men and set fire to shops and homes in the district. National Guard troops, so the army, were brought in and martial law was declared. Martial law is when the military come in and take control of a situation, and ordinary law is temporarily suspended. So that's what happened, and the military came in and took control of the situation. At the end of it all, around 10,000 black people were left homeless. Property damage amounted to more than 1.5 million in real estate and around $750,000 in personal property. In modern day money, that would be around $32.5 million. The property was never recovered and the families were never compensated. Most of them left the area and had to rebuild their lives again somewhere else. The image on the right shows what was left of Greenwood after the massacre. Unfortunately, the Black Wall Street massacre was not an isolated event. 2 years later, something similar happened over 1,000 miles away in Rosewood, Florida. The Rosewood Massacre was another racially motivated massacre of black people and the destruction of a black town that took place in the January of 1923 in Levy County, Florida. Historically, the initial settlers of Rosewood were both black and white, but by 1900 the population of Rosewood had become predominantly black, with many whites moving to the neighbouring town of Sumner. We know Jim Crow laws were common in the South during the late 19th century, and Florida had imposed legal racial segregation under these laws, requiring separate black and white public facilities and transportation. In 1920, the residents of Rosewood were mostly self-sufficient. They had 3 churches, a school, a large Masonic hall, a turpentine mill, a sugarcane mill, a baseball team named the Rosewood Stars, and 2 general stores, one of which was white-owned. The village had about a dozen 2-story wooden plank homes, other small 2-room houses, and several small unoccupied plank farm and storage structures. Some families even owned pianos, organs, and other symbols of middle-class prosperity. In short, the black people that lived in Rosewood were not poor. They had built their wealth and established a community of their own. Every business in town was black-owned with the exception of one, so economically the money was kept within the black community. In the years before the massacre, Florida had a significantly high number of lynchings of black men, including a well-publicized incident in December 1922. So, what happened to trigger the events that led to the destruction of Rosewood? Well, in January 1923, white men from nearby towns lynched a Rosewood resident, allegedly in response to an allegation made by a white woman named Fannie Taylor. Taylor was from the nearby town of Sumner, and she had claimed that she had been assaulted by a black drifter. A drifter is someone who moves from place to place and doesn't really have a fixed address. So anyway, what had happened was Fanny's husband had noticed bruises on her body, and when he had asked her how she had got them, she said she had been assaulted by a black drifter. It should be noted that it later transpired the woman had lied about the whole incident, and she was actually having an affair with another man named John Bradley who worked for the railways. They had got into a fight and he had hit her, but Fanny didn't want to confess the affair to her husband. Anyway, the accusation was made that a black drifter had assaulted a white woman in Sumner, and the white men of Sumner responded by taking a black man from Rosewood and lynching him. A mob of several hundred white men combed the countryside hunting for black people and setting fire to buildings in Rosewood. This included houses as well as businesses. The mob went through Rosewood and they burned every building with the exception of the one white-owned general store. It was documented that at least 6 black people and 2 white people were killed. However, eyewitness accounts suggested a much higher death toll of around 27 to 150 black people. There were survivors from Rosewood, and they survived by hiding for several days in nearby swamps until they were eventually evacuated by train or by car to larger towns. No arrests were ever made for what happened in Rosewood. The town was abandoned by its former black and white residents, and none of them ever moved back. At the time, no one was ever compensated. However, in 1993, the Florida legislature commissioned a report into the incident, and the results of the findings meant that Florida became the first US state to compensate survivors and their descendants for damages incurred because of racial violence. Here we have a few photos. On the left, you can see the burning embers of what remained of the town following the massacre. The top right, you can see one of the survivors at the unveiling of a memorial at the site of the old Rosewood town. And on the bottom right is a photo of one of the Rosewood resident families before the destruction of the town. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the African American male was a clinical study conducted between 1932 and 1972 by the United States Public Health Service. It's more commonly referred to as the Tuskegee experiment. The aim of the study was to observe the behavior of untreated syphilis, a sexually transmitted bacterial infection. The study was conducted on African American men, and the men participating in the study were only told that they were receiving free health care from the federal government of the United States. To clarify, none of the men participating in the study signed up to be a part of the study. No men participating in the study knew they were part of the study. No men in the study had given informed consent. All they were told was that they were receiving free health care. So, what happened? Well, the experiment began in 1932, and at the time, there was no known treatment for syphilis. Today, we know more about the disease, and it can be cured with a short course of antibiotics. But, like I said, at the time, there was no known treatment, let alone a cure. So, under the disguise of free healthcare, the US Public Health Service recruited 600 African American men to essentially be guinea pigs for the experiment. Most of the participants were sharecroppers, and many had never visited a doctor ever, so they didn't know what to expect. The doctors told the participants they were being treated for bad blood, which at the time was a term commonly used to refer to a variety of ailments without committing to a specific prognosis. 399 of the participants had latent syphilis already, and the other 201 were free of the disease and used as a control group. The men were then monitored by health workers, but only given placebos such as aspirin and mineral supplements. In 1947, penicillin became the recommended treatment for syphilis, and despite this fact, it was denied to the participants of the study. In fact, the Public Health Service researchers asked local physicians not to treat any of the participants of the study, and research was done at the Tuskegee Institute. In order to track the disease's full progression, researchers provided no effective healthcare. The long-term effects of untreated syphilis is loss of sight, mental health issues, and possibly death. So, as a result of the doctors' ineffective care, or rather putting their research before the lives of these men, they effectively allowed the men to die, to go blind, go insane, or experience other severe health problems due to their untreated syphilis. In the mid 1960s, a public health service venereal disease investigator in San Francisco named Peter Buxton found out about the Tuskegee study and expressed his concerns to his superiors, citing that the nature of the study was unethical. In response, public health service officials formed a committee to review the study, but ultimately opted to continue it, saying the goal was to track the participants until they had all died. Then autopsies would be performed and the project data could be analysed. Peter Buxton wasn't happy with this result, and he leaked the story to a reporter friend who passed it on to a fellow reporter named Jean Heller, who worked for the Associated Press. Heller broke the story in July of 1972, which caused public outrage and forced the study to shut down. However, by the time the study was shut down, 28 of its participants had suffered and died as a direct result of untreated syphilis. 100 more had passed away from complications related to untreated syphilis, and at least 40 spouses had been diagnosed with it, and the disease had been passed on to 19 children at birth. As a result of the Tuskegee experiment, many African Americans developed a lingering mistrust of public health officials. This sentiment resonated with Black people through the world, and the mistrust of medical practitioners is often the reason why many illnesses in the Black community go undiagnosed or untreated. In the mid 1960s, a public health service venereal disease investigator in San Francisco named Peter Buxton found out about the Tuskegee study and expressed his concerns to his superiors, citing that the nature of the study was unethical. In response, public health service officials formed a committee to review the study, but ultimately opted to continue it, saying the goal was to track the participants until they had all died. Then autopsies would be performed and the project data could be analysed. Peter Buxton wasn't happy with this result, and he leaked the story to a reporter friend who passed it on to a fellow reporter named Jean Heller, who worked for the Associated Press. Heller broke the story in July of 1972, which caused public outrage and forced the study to shut down. However, by the time the study was shut down, 28 of its participants had suffered and died as a direct result of untreated syphilis. 100 more had passed away from complications related to untreated syphilis, and at least 40 spouses had been diagnosed with it, and the disease had been passed on to 19 children at birth. As a result of the Tuskegee experiment, many African Americans developed a lingering mistrust of public health officials. This sentiment resonated with Black people through the world, and the mistrust of medical practitioners is often the reason why many illnesses in the Black community go undiagnosed or untreated. So, eugenics. Cases began to arise in which African American women would go into hospital for a routine surgery, so tonsils or appendix removal, something simple, and later found out that they had been sterilized while there. Just in case you don't know what sterilization is, it's a surgery that makes someone unable to have children. The state of North Carolina was seen as having the most aggressive eugenics program out of the 32 states that had one. Between 1929 and 1974, during the 45-year reign of the North Carolina Eugenics Board, a disproportionate number of those who were targeted for forced or coerced sterilization were Black and female, with almost all being poor. And of the 7,600 women who were sterilized by the state between the years of 1933 and 1973, about 5,000 of those were African American. That's 2/3 of the women to ever be sterilized in the state. It's a shockingly high number, and in light of this fact, North Carolina became the first state to offer compensation to surviving victims of compulsory sterilization. It's worth mentioning that this wasn't just an issue affecting the South. Between 1909 and 1979, African American women in California made up just 1% of the state's population, yet they accounted for 4% of the total number of sterilization operations conducted by the state during that period. According to a study in 1989, 31.6% of African American women without a high school diploma were sterilized, while only 14.5% of white women of the same educational status were sterilized. So let's just look back for a second. Historically, black people in America were denied education and freedoms that were offered to white people. Historically, they were denied the opportunity to work at certain jobs, often only being able to get low paying jobs, which has led to issues of poverty that still affect the African American community today. So, when historically society has led them to this position where they find themselves poorer than their white counterparts, and then federal funding for birth control is targeted at the poor, the question is raised, is it strategic or is it just a coincidence? So, I realize I've spoken a lot about race relations in the United States, and you may believe this is because the UK abolished slavery, everything was absolutely fine, everybody in the UK lived in perfect harmony, but unfortunately, that was not the case at all. Since the 16th century, there has been a consistent black presence in the UK. After the First World War, the UK faced an economic downturn, and in the wake of the end of the First World War and demobilisation of the armed forces, there was a surplus of labour, which then led to Britain's workers being unhappy with the situation, in particular, seamen. White working class union workers and former servicemen who didn't have the resources to challenge shipping bosses targeted, blamed, and took their frustrations out on blacks and other ethnic minorities, seeing them as foreign competitors for not just jobs but also for the attention of white women. And they saw blacks as a threat to Britain's post war national identity. Things eventually came to a head in January 1919. From the 23rd to the 30th of January 1919, the British Seafarers Union and the National Sailors and Firemen's Union held an anti-immigrant labour meeting in Glasgow, and they blamed foreigners for undercutting white British employment. At one London dock, black and white seamen waited to see if they would be hired. Tensions rose, and the men started pushing and shoving each other, and that pushing and shoving soon turned into a full-blown fight. The fight spilled into the yard, where white bystanders joined in, using knives and makeshift weapons to attack black labourers. From January 1919, similar riotous scenes became a regular occurrence throughout many ports up and down the UK, with the most ferocious and sustained rioting taking place in Liverpool in June. At the time, Liverpool had one of the highest black populations of any city in the UK. When rioting broke out at the docks, it soon spilled throughout the streets. White rioters lynched a young Afro-Caribbean man named Charles Wotton, and Liverpool's rioting crowd grew to around 10,000 people. Police ended up arresting dozens of rioters. Out of fear for their safety, 700 ethnic minorities were temporarily removed from their homes and sought police protection. Black workers were also fired during the riots, while black, Arab, and Chinese homes and businesses were damaged or set ablaze by angry white rioters. The government did not reimburse victims for property damages. By mid-June, blacks in Salford were also attacked. Their properties were also damaged or destroyed. Police intervention in the riots was slow. However, when blacks retaliated against white rioters, the police intervened and arrested them. At the end of the riots, 5 people were killed, many were injured, and at least 250 had been arrested. In the aftermath of the June riots, the British government, which had been monitoring black communities, intensified its repatriation scheme. A repatriation scheme is it's a scheme in which someone is sent back to the country that they came from. So, simply put, the British government's solution to racial tension was to get rid of black people, many of which had served the country during the war. The first move to repatriate colonial citizens in Britain was actually launched in February 1919, following the initial outbreaks of violence at ports up and down the country. However, after the June riots, the government began removing colonial citizens from Britain out of fear of a black backlash. The government offered repatriates a resettlement allowance of £2 to £5, plus an additional £5 disembarkment allowance. Between 1919 and 1921, an estimated 3,000 black seamen and their families were removed from Britain under the repatriation scheme. Shipping companies that employed West Indians also aided the state by firing black labourers and returning them to the West Indies. The United States and Great Britain are not the only places that have fallen victim to white supremacy. White supremacy is a legacy from colonisation, so it makes sense that other ex-colonies have also been affected by it. For example, Australia. Similar to the American South, Australia actually implemented policies, and these policies forbid non-whites from emigrating to Australia. The collective name for these policies became known as White Australia Policy and started around 1901, shortly after Australia became a federation. The Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 forbid people of non-European ethnic origin from immigrating to Australia and was drafted by a man named Alfred Deakin, who would go on to be Australia's second Prime Minister. The passage of this bill marked the commencement of the White Australia Policy as Australian federal government policy. In 1897, before Australia passed the Immigration Restriction Act, the Colonial Secretary for the British government, a man named Joseph Chamberlain, explained, "We quite sympathised with the determination of these colonies that there should not be an influx of people alien in civilisation, alien in religion, alien in customs, whose influx, moreover, would seriously interfere with the legitimate rights of the existing labouring population." In short, he felt that people who were different, or alien, as he put it, shouldn't be able to go to a country and interfere with the rights of the people there. The use of the word legitimate is interesting, as it almost implies those coming in shouldn't be afforded those same rights. In 1902 came the Commonwealth Franchise Act. Now, as we know from when we looked at colonialism, the Maori of New Zealand had signed a treaty in which they were considered British subjects. Therefore, Maori residents in Australia were granted the right to vote, a right that was denied to Indigenous Australians. The people to whom Australia had been taken from were not given a voice in their own land. The Australian government didn't really want to grant the Maori equal rights. It was done very much reluctantly, and all other Pacific Islanders were still subject to the White Australia policy. Apartheid was a system of institutionalised racial segregation that existed in South Africa and South West Africa from 1948 until the early 1990s. Apartheid in South Africa was characterised by an authoritarian political culture based on white supremacy and was set up to ensure that South Africa was dominated politically, socially, and economically by the nation's minority white population. Yes, you heard me correctly. The minority white population dominated politically, socially, and economically. So I guess it goes without saying that within this system of social classification and separation, white citizens had the highest status, followed in descending order by Asians, coloureds, and black Africans. In this context, coloureds were non-whites, usually of mixed race. Apartheid was so ingrained that its economic legacy and social effects continue to this day, 26 years after it ended. So let's look a little deeper at apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was categorised as petty apartheid and grand apartheid. Petty apartheid entailed the segregation of public facilities and social events, and then grand apartheid dictated housing and employment opportunities by race. And if you've been paying attention, you will have spotted the similarities between apartheid and Jim Crow. Jim Crow and apartheid are essentially the same thing by a different name and geographical location. Apartheid was adopted as a formal policy by the South African government after the ascension of the National Party during the 1948 general elections. Prior to the 1940s, some aspects of apartheid had already emerged in the form of minority rule by white South Africans and the socially enforced separation of black Africans from other races. This later extended to pass laws and land apportionment. Pass laws were a body of laws in operation in South Africa under apartheid. They controlled the rights of black people to residence and travel, and implemented by means of identity documents compulsorily carried. Land apportionment refers to specific areas in which black people could live or purchase land, and that was if they were allowed to purchase land at all. The first apartheid law was the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949. This was closely followed by the Immorality Amendment Act of 1950, which made it illegal for most South African citizens to marry or pursue sexual relationships across racial lines. Many of you probably know someone with one white parent and one black parent. In South Africa during apartheid, their relationship was deemed illegal and punishable by incarceration in jail. Some of you may have heard of a comedian named Trevor Noah. Well, he was born as a mixed race child into this system. His mother was classified as black, his father was classified as white, he himself was classified as coloured. When he was born, interracial relationships were illegal, and he talks about this in his autobiography, Born a Crime. Apartheid eventually ended in 1994 with the election of Nelson Mandela. Mandela, as most of us know, was a South African anti-apartheid revolutionary, political leader and philanthropist who served as President of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. He was the country's first black head of state and the first elected in a fully representative democratic election. Nelson Mandela's government focused on dismantling the legacy of apartheid by tackling institutionalized racism and fostering racial reconciliation. Again, if you've been thinking what we've discussed happened a long time ago and isn't relevant now, apartheid ended in 1994. That's just 26 years ago. If you know someone over the age of 26, this happened within their lifetime. It wasn't actually that long ago, and as I mentioned earlier, the social and economic effects still exist today. So let's just quickly recap white supremacy. White supremacy is the belief that white people should be dominant in any society or within any institution. White supremacy was prevalent in the United States before the Civil War and still remained after. The KKK, a white supremacist organization, is not classified as a terrorist group despite targeting non-whites with violence. The implementation of Jim Crow laws in the American South enforced racial segregation and highlighted issues regarding white supremacy. The affluent black towns of Greenwood and Rosewood were burned to the ground by white men. The Tuskegee experiment used male African American participants to investigate the effects of untreated syphilis without informing the participants and with the knowledge that they would die without treatment. Eugenics programs in the United States disproportionately targeted African American women for sterilization. Race riots in the UK during the early 20th century were the result of white people feeling that black people shouldn't be afforded the opportunity to work the same jobs as them. The black people in this instance were repatriated. White Australia policy at the beginning of the 20th century was established to stop anyone of non-European ethnic origin from immigrating to Australia. Finally, apartheid in South Africa was implemented to force segregation of black and whites and to give power to the minority white population.